So the first thing I want to say is, what revolution are we even talking about? So I kind of stole this languaging from the Resistance Choir. Revolution needs music, is that right? Or did I just totally change it? Okay, something like that. But so then my mind started going, well, what else does a revolution need? And there's a whole set of sermons. Our theme this month is Rise Up, because March is springtime and we march forth. And so, about like how do we sort of holistically and sustainably rise up in harmony with the seasons? And so I thought, the revolution needs Buddhist debate, it needs nonviolent communication, and it needs my grandparents' values. So those are our sermons this month. It should be pretty interesting where we go with that. But as I sat down to work on today's talk, I had this impulse to not just make it about my liberal agenda about what a revolution should be about. I imagine if you're in the UU church this morning, you have a similar liberal agenda. But I had this longing to sort of speak on something that was not too partisan, to give a talk that might apply across the board. Because I think when you're talking about logic, that it really should apply in all situations. So the revolution I wanted to talk about is, of course, my liberal progressive climate change, universal basic income revolution. But you don't have to believe in that to listen to this talk and still get some fun stuff out of it. Because I believe that any revolution worth its salt, is that an expression? Worth its salt, it needs Buddhist debate. And I don't mean something religious. There are three particular principles that I'm going to talk about, but I've learned them through the art of Buddhist logic and debate. And so I really think that if many of us were able to include these principles in the way we talk about important issues, we might be able to make a lot of headway, or at least save ourselves a lot of stress. Okay, so why does any good revolution need these type of principles? Well, it's all about reason. So it actually has to do with nonviolent theories of social change. Nonviolent theories of social change. You may have noticed that you live in a culture where might is right philosophy is still quite prevalent. Right? This was the reigning worldview for millennia of human history, and it's still sort of in there. A good 30 or 40% of the American population still think if you've got the guns, then you get to make the rules, right? Or if your religion has been in the forefront, then everybody else should just shut up because you're in the seat of power and everyone else has to listen. There are only, I'm all choked up about that. There are only kind of two other ways that I've been educated that actually really work to create social change, and that is changing people's hearts and changing people's minds. Right? So you can gather the power and enforce social change, but if you don't have hearts and minds on board, it's sort of like, have you ever tried pressing down a log in the lake? If you were lucky enough to get to hang out in a lake with how those logs got in there, I'm not sure. And you press it down. As hard as you press down is as hard as that thing is going to pop up and hit your little brother right in the face. Hopefully a rubber ball would be better to hit your little brother. Right? So similarly, if we're looking at I imagine that most of us here are a little bit concerned with the drought, flood, fire cycle that is the new California ecology. And that shows no signs of changing, right? That, unless we somehow took some radical action, and then maybe in 50 years, or 100 years, or a couple hundred years, but we sort of have to do something about that to avoid loss of lives and lives pretty quickly. Now, how are you going to get that done? Well, in the short term, you can gather whatever kind of power you have and sort of, but if there's still, if there are 40% of the people in your country who don't agree with you, you have a very tenuous hold on whatever advancements you've made. And I think speaking from the liberal side of the revolution, I think that we may have seen that in the end of the Obama era and its rapid turnaround, right? So without changing hearts and minds, you haven't actually changed society, right? It's a difficult truth for me to handle, but I think it's something that a lot of people on the liberal side of the revolution have been faced with. Whoa, I thought we were moving forward, and then you get the rubber band effect, right? So my first thought is that any revolution that isn't a revolution that just goes around and then comes on back, not that kind of revolution, but a revolution which is evolution, yeah, I made that one up yesterday, requires the use of reason. So it requires heart-changing tactics, and these are things that activists throughout the years have developed. How do you change people's hearts? How do you wake people up to marginalization and oppression and implicit violence and explicit violence and put it so in good-natured people's faces that they cannot support that anymore? But the other thing is, we actually have to use logic and reasoning to figure out how we want to run a society. And so anytime we're engaging in a conversation where logic and reasoning takes a back seat, I believe, it's a bit of a strong, wild belief, but I believe we are actually eroding civilized society. Anytime we contribute to or continue along in a debate where logic is not held as like this prized human possession, we're actually contributing to our society falling apart. So the revolution, whatever side, whatever revolution you're in, if you're not using logic, if you're not using reason, it's probably not going anywhere good. I really liked the argument from Steven Pinker in, I think he put it in his latest book, Enlightenment Now, really enjoyable book. And he says, any argument that you give me against the use of reason still has to use reason, right? Reason and argumentation are synonyms, right? So you can't logically argue against the use of logic. I think when we talk about violence and nonviolence and social change, anything that isn't using logic and compassion is not a nonviolent means of social change. The problem with violence is not, I do have a problem with harming others, but that's not actually its biggest problem. It's that you get this temporary change that you sort of enforced into place, and then that too is likely to turn into whatever violent regime you were trying to overthrow. Violence just breeds violence, just breeds violence. So there's got to be a cooler way. And I don't know if we've got enough time in society to sit around and learn how to talk well with reason. We might have to come up with some, call your millennial friends and have them come up with some radical tactics to change things fast. But in the long term solution, I think, has to be creating a culture of people who prize the use of compassionate reasoning together. So this is reason number one. Why the revolution? Your revolution in TV land. Whatever revolution you're a part of, I think it has to be based on reason, or it's not going anywhere good. Okay, that's pretty fun. So I thought about Buddhist debate, well, because I'm a Buddhist ordained person, and so occasionally I like to talk about my team. We all like to do it. I'm conscious of my side bias, so I put it in little chunks and put it out there in hopefully digestible proportions. So there's actually quite a bit wrong with Buddhist debate from my point of view. Let's just get that out of the way quickly. If used traditionally, you could actually use this to just inculcate a person in a set of beliefs, because one of the ways you can win the debate is if you can quote a scripture that gives the answer that you're trying to maintain. You say, well, Buddha said it, and then, oh, you won the debate. Great. So it can become a system of memorizing things and repeating them back. And I'll also disclaim, I will declaim a disclaimer right now. I actually really don't like debate, just personally. I enjoy sitting down and having a conversation with a person, but I think that debate, if you saw some of the 2016 presidential debates, I think the whole paradigm is flawed, because in my opinion, it's become less about this Greek reason that America sort of aped apes nowadays, but it's become about the council of apes. Which part of the populace can hoot loudest? That person won the debate. You saw the research, right, that says the monkeys that hoot loudest have the least reproductive potential. So it's the weakest monkeys who hoot. Okay, I'm sorry. Right, the smaller you feel, the louder you hoot. So we can't base whose ideas win the day, whose ideas are put on television, whose ideas get the most support by what do we like the most, who shouts, who's the loudest. I think this is kind of a real problem with debate in general. I love sitting down and having a conversation with diverse viewpoints. Oh man, and then we'll kind of convince each other and we'll fact check stuff on the magical devices that we hold right in our, dude, that is cool. But debate I'm a little wary of. So with these disclaimers, now I'm going to tell you all about a pep talk on why Buddhist debate is the best. Okay, so the main aspect that I wanted to share, this is the center point that I wanted to share today. There are a couple other points, but this is the big one, is that as I was learning the rules of Buddhist logic and how to have a Buddhist logic conversation, they told me one of the main rules is that you are never allowed to have a conversation like this without a basis in shared facts. So in Buddhist logic, you're not allowed to, let's say it's ancient India, well, it's two common era, the year 2 in the common era, and some Jain comes up to me and I'm a Buddhist and we're going to talk out the religious matters. Unless we can find a point to agree on, my religion says I'm not allowed to talk religious matters. We have to actually start with a point of agreement. And in ancient Buddhism, it's really weird. Like you would start with a Jain, you could start on the point of like karma, because they believe in karma too. But a materialist, this is what they call them in the old books, you can't start with that. You have to start with something else, because they don't believe in karma. So you can't start debating on, well, your guys' view on karma is a little weird. Our view says this. Because if they don't start out with that same belief in karma. So you're not allowed to have a conversation about something, the facts of which you don't agree on. Right? And so I just want us to think about this. Like, think about, have you found yourself in recent years, or maybe in your long-term history, sort of stuck? I always have this feeling like, how did I get in this conversation? Stuck in a conversation where you realize we don't even agree on the facts, like whether the world is round or something right? And that's kind of a really hard place to be, because the only thing you can do at that point is, excuse me, I've got to go to the bathroom. and it's not really going to go anywhere unless you have this basis. So what they say you are allowed to do in classical Buddhist logic is, on the basis of shared facts, you are allowed to lead the person to a conclusion that they may not have come up with on their own. Right? So on the basis of shared facts, you're allowed to lead the person to a conclusion that they may not have come up with on their own. With me so far? Okay, cool. Yep. So what else am I supposed to say here? Oh yeah, so if you don't believe me, which I looked for head nods, so I know that most of you do believe me. But if you didn't believe me, you could just try, okay, I'm going to go on the liberal biased revolution side again, but you could try talking to your conservative friend about white privilege and all the problems with white privilege. Have you ever actually tried this? Hey, I just wanted to tell you, white privilege is bad in this way, this way, this way, this way. And you may have noticed how challenging that conversation is, because you two don't agree on the fact that white privilege is a thing. Right? So you're talking about, like, well, white privilege did this and white privilege did that, and you can't talk that way because your privilege is showing, and this is this and that about white privilege. And to them, you're talking about a religious idea. It's like them coming to you and saying, well, we have to run the country on biblical principles because the Bible said run the country on biblical principles. Right? You're talking about whose myth is better, because they don't have shared facts about this strange unicorn called white privilege. Right? It would be like me coming, in Chinese medicine, they actually have uses for unicorn horn. You can heal a lot of diseases with the magical unicorn horn. Turns out it's rhinoceros horn. And you should not harvest that. But let's say it was unicorn, and I decided as a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine and part of my spiritual path, I want to give you a whole talk on how great unicorn horn is. And the revolution needs unicorn horn. And to you, you're like, what is this guy talking about? Unicorn horn doesn't even exist. That's kind of what we sound like to each other when we try to talk about these very important issues. And then, what kind of response do you get? Not a great one, right? So, this is a little bit interesting. Yes, his notes say, is it any wonder that it feels like these conversations are completely ridiculous? Right? It's a ridiculous conversation to be having. So, on the other side, I wanted to talk to you about another example of this, right? Have you tried to talk to somebody who, about how motivated we really ought to be about solving climate change to someone who does not believe in anthropogenic climate change? Right? This is a really hard conversation to have, right? And what I know on the liberal side of the revolution, and for my liberal friends, is that we will bring up a lot of good rhetorical tools. Right? I'm actually a fan of rhetoric when it's not used in place of logic. Right? So we will appeal to fear. Right? Well, when the roadways all wash away, where will you be then with your beliefs that climate change isn't real? Right? Okay, and then we'll bring up our appeals to authority. You mean you don't believe in science? Where I come from, science is real, and I'll put a sign about it in my front yard. Right? And does any of that work? No. Does it actually escalate the person to bring up more rhetoric from their side? And so there's no logic going on. There's just appeals to outrage on either side. It's a real hard challenge. But I mentioned a number of months ago, they did some work in Florida. I didn't write down the details because I just wanted to mention in passing. But they got together a bipartisan group, and they strategically avoided the use of the word climate change. And they talked about sea level rise. And somehow, when they talked about all the damage to property that's going to happen from sea level rise, people got really on board. Democrats, Republicans, independents, whoever else is in it, that, oh yeah, that's what I've seen sea level rise. It wrecked my friend's home. We've really got to do something about that. And what about this crazy weather? Have you noticed the hurricanes are actually increasing? Nobody's seen weather like this, not even in my grandfather. Yeah, that's right. What are we going to, my insurance won't cover this anymore. Yeah, what are we going to do about that? And this group of people got together and actually made new regulations, got new allocations of taxpayer funding to deal with the effects of extreme weather and sea level rise. Really kind of interesting. So if you wanted your country or your planet or a group of nations that signed the Paris Accord, some of which the giant ones are trying to pull out of now for some weird reason, you might stop trying to talk about mythic things that people don't believe in and see if there's anything that we do actually believe in together. What is a fact that we could start with that we could actually talk about? So, because the thing is, you're not going to convince anyone. Have you figured that out yet? I mean, some of us haven't figured it out. We like the fight enough that maybe if I just get meaner, then they'll see the error, because we want them to see the error of their ways, don't we? Gosh, wouldn't that be nice? We would be vindicated in our position. They'd see the error of their ways, and then we could go about, being right and making a better world for everyone. But people don't see the error of their ways in that way. And that goal, I'm kind of making a little mockery of it, but But that goal of making a better world for all of us, I think that's real and that's valid. But we're not going to get there through depending on people like seeing our point. And I think the reason is we're not starting on the basis of shared facts, right? We don't have something that we can test the validity of together. It happens with news sources, right? Have you had one of these conversations where, well, I saw on CNN, you said CNN, that's the liberal elite media, didn't you know? That's right, see, that's the liberal elite. And so then they say back, well, I heard exactly the opposite thing on Fox News. Uh-oh, you said Fox News. Don't you know that that's the kleptocracy, corporatocracy, vulture, capitalist paid something or other? And we're both trying to talk about news. Like, the interesting thing is, we see each other as an enemy, but we're attempting to find some fact, some piece of information that we can test the validity of together. We're doing it in culturally suicidal ways, right? We're doing it in culture-destroying methods of who's right battles. But we're attempting to find a piece of information that then we can form conclusions based on. And we just don't know that we haven't taken that far enough. So, I don't know, what's a news source that people trust? Is the Associated Press still a thing? I don't know, are there news sources that people trust? Is there something that's so independent, so lambasting of liberals and conservatives that some of us might be able to get together? And I'm not talking about like wild people who will just call you names right off the bat. No, I'm talking about people who otherwise you might be able to have a conversation, right? One of the great things in Buddhist debate is they have this thing of like, if a person refuses to use logic, then you sort of just, you go, I can't converse with someone who won't have a reasonable conversation, and you just walk away. It's like that quote, arguing with someone who won't use logic is like trying to play chess with a pigeon. Right? No matter how skillful your moves are, they're still going to poop on the board and strut around like they won. So, but according to the research that I've read, that's actually it. They get a lot of news time, but it's actually a very, very, very small slice of our population. The rest of us are people. I know it doesn't look like it from our my side bias. I know it's just a bunch of idiots out there. How could they be so led astray and just listen to whatever? But look at the research on why liberals believe in climate change. Ask them to explain climate science to you, and the research shows you they can't. They believe climate change is real because someone told them it is real. Maybe not UUs in Los Gatos, right? Because I gave that talk a while ago, and they were, why is climate change a thing? But both sides are actually arguing from religious ideals of what their party told them to believe, and we divide on important issues along party lines. So it might be important for us to stop dismissing people, assuming we'll never find a basis of fact that we can both talk about, and start looking a little harder and see if those facts, if those sources do exist somewhere, so that we can have a reasonable conversation outside of our partisan biases. Now, I'm not saying, quick, don't write me off. I'm not saying your partisan biases are not wrong or not important. Your partisan goals, right? I am way on the liberal side of the street. But I believe that the way we talk to each other is mostly an exchange of biases rather than exchange of ideas. And if we want to move forward, if we want the liberal goal of an inclusive society, one where we don't work things out by talking louder or punching harder, we're going to have to learn to talk in inclusive. We'll ask you to talk to each other, because otherwise your brain will get tired of listening to me, and that's my worst fear. So we're going to do a tiny momentary interpersonal contemplation. And I would love, if you want to play, let me remind you of the rules. If you want to play, you look around with open body language and facial expression, and that means someone's allowed to talk to you. But if you don't want to play, if you're feeling quite introverted, Okay, you can do this occasionally to make sure you don't have to go right down anyone. But we're going to agree to watch each other's body language. And then if you would like, look to a neighbor, somebody nearby who looks interesting, and tell them about when's the last time you either had one of these conversations where it just didn't work, or have you had an experience where you really thought you were going to be in an entrenched bias conversation and somehow you found a way to come back to sharing ideas. Those are rarer in these days, but maybe they exist. So find out if that ever happened to your neighbor. We'll take about 2 minutes for this. Oh, hi. Welcome back. Never ends a good conversation.
You know when they're really good?
So, to be continued at coffee hour. Ooh, yeah, cliffhanger. So, did you hear, were there any success stories? What, you want to share?
Yeah, I learned some.
What did you hear?
Well, I learned more details about that I've probably heard before, but didn't really incorporate how the climate does change, what makes it change.
Yeah.
And then I also learned that when you try to talk to somebody who doesn't agree with the problem of climate change, what they tell you is, well, the climate's always changing, the temperature is always going up and down. It has nothing to do with what humans do.
That's right.
And so that's as far, you interrupt us, so we can.
Because I want to talk about that, but more on climate change, or more on coffee hour.
What do you mean moron when you say that? As long as you're not talking to me.
All right. What was any other success stories? We don't have time to hear every story.
Well, a lot of my relatives on the internet are very conservative. They live in the South. They grew up with the evangelical faith. So they constantly try to persuade me to join them. But anyway, one day it said one of my relatives posted a thing about gun control and saying, if we have gun control, only criminals will have guns.
Right. Yeah.
Or maybe it was Obamacare. And then they also complained about Obamacare.
Right. If we have Obamacare, only criminals will have guns.
I borrowed a post from somebody else that said, let me get this straight. Gun ownership is a human right, but health care isn't. And maybe a few days later, maybe a week or so later, I got another post from that same relative saying, okay, so Obamacare and Second Amendment are established. Don't touch either one of them.
Interesting. I really enjoy that. There's kind of principles that we'll talk about next week, but when you can find a shared value, often we can actually, and it's hard, don't get me wrong, I know how hard it feels and how hard it is, but occasionally when you can find, like you saw their value for rights and for freedom and for autonomy, and instead of going, that value is wrong, you said, here's how I express that value. And all of a sudden you have a shared basis of dialogue instead of competing monologues. Pretty amazing. Okay, last one, because you gasped.
Should I go for it?
Yeah, you go.
So I'm in the process of one debate on climate change and other things with some of my conservative friends, and I'm sort of a centrist, but so we're not quite there yet. But I did find what their fear is, which is pretty classic. And what our fear, the liberal side's fear is, which is also pretty classic, and the fear from the conservative side is fear of government control.
Right.
That's what they fear most.
Yeah.
And on the fear of the liberal side is fear of corporate control.
Right.
And that's more or less what we fear. So it's kind of important to get to their underlying, they were calling it all a hoax and everything, and I go, what's the hoax,
Yeah.
Oh, you're worried about government control, when actually it's the corporations who are trying to maintain control of this situation and can making their profits. So we're not there yet, but we might.
Yeah, very interesting, because now you know what you're talking about.
And that's why we're UUs, because we're completely out of control.
Lisa, did you have anything?
Oh, well, we were having that discussion, so I was going to say basically the same thing. But I think what would be really interesting, and maybe that common ground you're looking for, is looking at how corporate and governments are kind of.
That's what I like to talk about, and I like to talk about conservatives conservatives and liberals about that, and we often have some very fruitful conversations.
Yeah.
Why is that not all over the news? I wonder. Okay, anyway, don't cut me off, Facebook. I know you've done that before when things get heavy. So, so really interesting. And I love that as the last comment, because when you can find those shared bases, then some magic can happen. And I don't know about you, but I've had, some of those, the word intractable comes to my mind, right? You get to some of these conversations and it's just like, I think it means no traction is able to do, and it feels just awful to be stuck in there. But then if you have one of these moments, they come kind of by magic, right? Where, wait, we agree on this, and you can talk about it. It feels like the whole sky just opened up. Like there's room, it's not completely hopeless. And here's the thing. I think that on each side of the aisle, one side tends to like to jump. If the conversation gets hard, one side goes, you anti-science, racist, homophobe. And the other side goes, you elitist, snowflake, blah, 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 blah. And often they do that before making very much of an attempt to see if we're trying to use reason, but we have a different basis of factuality that we're working from, right? We're quick to accuse others of having faulty logical facilities, and maybe the thing is we're just not yet speaking the same language in some cases. Some cases, okay? I mean, still, when in doubt, vote them out. But also, you got to learn how to talk this. We have to please let's never see debates like 2016, where your main debate tactic is following a lady around on the stage, like the men have done throughout years as intimidation tactics. Like, that's not a debate. Okay. So how many conversations may have been cut short prematurely before that magic moment, just because we slipped into name-calling or sectarianism? All right, 2 more points. They're not too hard. So this is the main one I want about Buddhist debate, is you have to base it on shared facts, or at least shared values. And then you can form new conclusions, right? Oh, if we share this value, what might we be able to think about? But if we can't start there, it's just a battle. It's just bickering all the time. The other cool thing is, I always like to put in a little bit of like sustainable activism in every sermon nowadays, because I hear people with the fire for activism and also the sense of overwhelm and fatigue that comes when the fire for activism starts to burn you out. I mean, light you up. So one of the things that activists have known for a long time, and if in the last elections you went canvassing for any issues, is that you have to have a script, right? Otherwise, your arguments are going to fail as soon as you get a question you weren't looking for, right? So what's cool is they do this in Buddhist debate. It's actually very binary. What happens? So this guy shouts at you and claps his hands at you, and he says stuff like, "Nobody can tell me the Buddhist Four Noble Truths." And then your answer as a young first grade student is supposed to be, "That's wrong, I can tell you." So they'll shout all of these weird propositions at you, and then you only basically have 3 answers. One answer, which sounds just like in English, is you can go, "Duh," which means, "That's right." As in like, well, duh, everybody knows that. The other answer is, your reason is wrong, and you're supposed to be shouting at these. Your reason is wrong. And then the other answer is, that doesn't logically follow. These are your only three answers. Right? So the guy's shouting all this, climate change is made by humans and therefore it's a government hoax. And you have to go, okay, wait, which one's wrong with that? If it wasn't made by humans, it would necessarily follow that it's a government hoax. So it's not, doesn't necessarily follow. Is that true? No, I don't think that's true. Your reason is wrong, right? Climate change, maybe it is, and here are my facts. So there are only so many responses that one can make. This is, my martial arts mentor was teaching me about this the other day. You know, there are only, in boxing, they call it the sweet science, because there are only like 7 punches. You know, you got straights, you got hooks, you got uppercuts, and you got an overhand. And that's pretty much all you got. So if you learn how to deal with the straights, deal with the hooks, deal with the uppercuts, deal with the overhands, then it's just a matter of putting those in at the right spot. The same thing actually happens when we're trying to discourse, dialogue about something that is important, right? Oh, such and such is... Well, any well-trained activist actually has a list of responses. They have a flow chart. And if you're doing your doctorate debates at least in the biblical monasteries, you actually make a flow chart about all these questions. It's usually on a topic, right? You know, proving that past lives exist. And you would go through all the questions the guy might ask you and all the little branches, and you would just memorize the answer to each branch. Sounds arduous, eh? But how many of us are very, very passionate about certain societal issues and haven't gone through the work of memorizing the responses to arguments against them because it's too arduous? Oh man, saving all that rainforest, boy, that sounds hard. I guess I'll just not. Don't be that guy. Don't be that guy. So the revolution needs Buddhist debate because it also trains your mind into how to flow through the logical responses to every possible counter-argument, right? And they use this because it trains the mind. So what's cool, you know, this hand-clapping thing, there's a myth actually that there's like some guy who got turned into a donkey, and he's actually a demon. He comes to the debate ground late at night. So the guys clap their hands so that you know it's not hooves. But I thought that was cute. Donkey demon, get out! But really, it's supposed to symbolize like your top hand is wisdom and your bottom hand is ignorance. And so the whole debate, the whole idea is that this guy's questioning you and shouting at you, and underneath it all is this idea that we're gonna scathe away at fixed patterns of faulty thinking by doing this practice. It's really cool. And what you get, you know, they do these debates all throughout this monastic education. And by the time you're in, like, the equivalent of high school, the idea is that you're supposed to be this well-honed logic machine. Right? So, and they do it in this environment. Like, the other monks are around, and if you don't answer a question in time, it's like the wave at a football game, but kind of derisive. Like, they would start on this side, and they would, oh, ah! You know, and they like shout at you for not getting your answer in time. And the idea is, I mean, again, this is one of the things I find questionable. I don't know if that's an educational tactic. But the notion is that if you're sitting at like Easter, that's what time of year it is, Easter brunch with the family, and you bring up this thing, and the whole family's like, oh, that's the stupidest liberal idea I ever heard. Your mind is still like, your reason is wrong. Does not necessarily follow. Because you trained it instead of appealing to your own outrage, being the prey of your own rhetorical fallacies, you've trained yourself to just calmly, logically present your story as an act of compassion. At the bottom of it all, it's because we want to share our hearts together. When we get afflicted by our own need to be right in that moment, we neither convince anyone, nor do we get to share our heart in that moment. Okay, so know your script. The last point. In our last Green Sanctuary class, Rob reread the agreements or something like that, and one of them was, It's okay to be messy. It's okay. And I really resonated with that because as a person, I feel messy all the time. So, and the explanation was like, we're maybe not going to figure out how to have full ecological justice today. It's okay to be messy. It's okay to have confusion, have unanswered questions and leftovers and stuff like that. And the third point about Buddhist debate is the idea, classically, what this is supposed, logic is really cool, but it's supposed to wake you up to this element of our lives where logic doesn't hit and make you okay with that. In Buddhism, they call this emptiness. And it's this weird term, but let's talk about it as maybe like none of our strategies are 100%. Have you ever heard of like a 100% successful political strategy that everyone agreed with and there was no one piece of research that said it might not? No. So that split down the middle. Conservatives tend to think the government's out to get you. Liberals maybe think the corporations are out to get you. And there's some truth in that the government is out to get you. Like, so even some of my greatest, like, well, if we just sign everybody up in a registry for stuff like that, it's like, well, but what if you make a registry for Muslims? Doesn't sound as great. Then, oh, I can, and then, so, really? And then we've got over here, oh, these tech giants donated stuff to people. Oh, wow, aren't they great? Yeah, but they also cataloged all your information and sold it to the highest bidder. Wow. And we should know that there's always a counter-argument to everything we propose. And that, I think, hits to, this is why I sometimes get nervous at these sermons, because my mind is trained to think of all the counter-arguments. I'm like, okay, just get through it. Wait, hopefully they don't bring them until coffee hour. We can talk about it then, if we're caffeinating, it'll be okay. But it's supposed to train you in this thing of, down at the bottom, I think we really want to believe that we can find the right answer. So it's not only, it manifests as my side bias and partisan loyalty and this kind of inner nationalism and stuff like that. But I think down at the core, we really want some security and safety and to feel that we could find the right answer someday. And this, according to these debaters, infects our conversations with people. When our strategies are questioned, with the inherent instability. Look, sometimes you're talking to really intelligent people who are willing to agree on facts and they still question your ideas. That's not nice. And when the inherent instability comes up, it can be easy to clench down, dig in our heels, grit our teeth, and just keep sort of saying the same thing over and over. But if we've trained ourselves to open and say, perhaps that strategy isn't 100% viable, but it's the best one I know, and it's the one that aligns the most with my ethics. And to be okay with being messy. It gives us a chance, instead of building walls between our hearts, which appeal to our sense of safety. I've got my nice walled-off solution, my nice walled-off, platform that I'm going to present. Instead of building that, we might be able to reach across those barriers every once in a while and see what lives on the other side. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be safe. It's not actually a great short-term solution. But if we want to build a society where we meet together with minds and hearts, those of us who hold that ideal need to start meeting together with people, with our minds and our hearts. And that's why I think the revolution needs Buddhist debate. So if you would, let's stand together. We'll sing our final benediction.